In the last segment, we talked about aspects of the names Yahweh and Elohim in the book of Genesis. Now we're taking up Exodus, but before I went ahead with that, I wanted to just show you two of the sources for our last discussions. Gustav Eller, Old Testament Theology, and A.B. Davidson, The Theology of the Old Testament, both published in the late Victorian era. So those are great sources on the various names of God in the Old Testament and their theological significance. Now, Exodus, salvation or service, which comes first? In the last segment, we traced the grace of God in the descendants of Abraham. The lives of Isaac, Jacob, and all but one of his sons showed little in the way of loyalty to the God of Abraham. But the God of Abraham knew all their defections in advance, for he had foretold they would be 400 years in Egypt, before even Isaac was born. That's in Genesis chapter 15. Would God therefore be surprised by their little faith while in Egypt? Yahweh had called Abram from among Babylon's idolaters, and Abram's family continued to be plagued by idolatry and puny faith. But in their misery, under a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph, they cried out to their ancestral God, though they had apparently all but forgotten his covenant name, Yahweh. Yahweh had not forgotten them. But why should he save them from Egypt? When had they, or their fathers for that matter, ever built a record of faithfulness to him? Nevertheless, Yahweh sends Moses with a command to Pharaoh, "Let my people go." What made Israel God's people? Nothing in them. Read what Yahweh says made them his people in Exodus chapter 3. Yahweh tells Moses to tell them, "Jehovah, the God of your forefathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you." Notice it is the God of Jacob, not the God of Israel, that Moses is to represent. Jacob the deceiver, and the father of deceivers and murderers. Yahweh, the God of Jacob, not the God of Israel, however princely Israel's future might be. Jacob, who learned through his own suffering and the suffering of his family that God calls us to faithfulness, but also Jacob, who had learned that our faithfulness cannot add to God's grace in calling us, who had learned that while we can multiply our blessings by our faithfulness, we cannot multiply God's mercy. "I am who I am," Yahweh says to Moses. Or, other translations render it, "I shall be what I shall be." Yahweh was now going to demonstrate on a vast scale what he had already demonstrated less dramatically in the lives of the patriarchs. He shall be what he is eternally. God to the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In saving his people, owing to nothing in them, but entirely due to his own promise, Yahweh would prove himself God to them, even as he had promised back in Genesis chapter 17, verse 8. And so it was. Despite Israel's continual quivering and quailing, Yahweh brings them not only out of Egypt, but into the wilderness where they are to meet their God. As he did to the patriarchs, Yahweh appears. Exodus chapter 19, verse 18. "And Mount Sinai smoked all over due to the fact that Jehovah came down upon it in fire." Jehovah's Witnesses. Can Jehovah come down upon a mountain in fire? Could Yahweh appear to Abram as a man? The same Yahweh who stood before Abraham in Genesis chapter 18 and then went up from him as a man, the same Jehovah who in Exodus 14 went ahead of Israel in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. The same God, we're now told, came down on a mountain in fire. But how can this be possible? I shall prove to be what I shall prove to be. If you are a Jehovah's Witness, don't let men tell you what God can and cannot do. Trust the Word, not the watchtower. In our next segment, you cannot serve Jehovah, for he is a holy God. The book of Leviticus.